With version 6.3 banners here, Zibai joining in the second half, and reruns like Mavuika, Skirk, and Flynn's likely coming back soon, it's finally time to analyze the best DPS characters you can pull for your account. So let's start with Zibai, since she's about to arrive next patch. As you already know, Zibai is a Lunar DPS who deals most of her damage through Lunar Crystallize. And what makes her so strong and so unique compared to other DPS units is that she's only the second unit in the game who can actually trigger Lunar Crystallize, which means she gives your account direct access to that entire reaction. And because she's a Lunar DPS, a lot of endgame content going forward is going to be designed around her, which naturally keeps her very high in meta rankings. In overall performance, she's roughly on the same level as Flynn's and Nefer, but here's the key difference. Both Flynn's and Nefer typically want 2 limited 5-star supports to reach their peak, while Zibai mainly needs just 1, Columbina. And that's both an advantage and a disadvantage, which we'll talk about in a second. Outside of Columbina, Iluga is her second best in slot support. Her gameplay is also very easy and one of the simplest playstyles in the game. You press skill, spam normal attacks, and then press skill again when you get the enhanced version. If you want the full rotation breakdown, you can check the dedicated guide on the channel. She's also insanely free-to-play friendly because she has one of the best F2P weapon options in the entire game, the 3-star Harbinger of Dawn. That alone makes her one of the most beginner-friendly Lunar DPS options. Now, before we talk about her downside, coming back to Zibai. Her biggest disadvantage is exactly what I mentioned earlier. Columbina is by far her best support. And unlike Flynn's and Nefer, where you still have functional alternatives even if you're missing one premium piece, Zibai without Columbina simply cannot compete. This becomes even more problematic if you own multiple Nod Cryo DPS units. For example, if you have both Nefer and Zibai, and both of them want Columbina, you're almost never going to play both teams together in Abyss, and after 5 or 6 months, when enemies get even stronger, you will always prefer running one full premium team instead of splitting supports and making both teams weaker. So if you already have Flynn's and Nefer, I genuinely do not recommend pulling another Lunar DPS. In the long term, you're just not going to run all of them, which means you're basically spending 90 pulls on a unit you won't use. In that situation, it's better to commit to the Lunar DPS you already own and skip Zibai. But if you don't have any Lunar DPS yet, then yes, pulling Zibai and building her best team can be a very strong choice. The second major issue is her lack of proper support depth. Her situation is similar to Skirk and Escoffier, and in some ways, it's even worse. Because even though Escoffier is the best support for Skirk, Skirk still has multiple usable alternatives like Farina, Yilan, Shenhe, Sitlali, and Mualani. But for Zibai, it's basically just Columbina. If you don't have her, you lose a massive amount of damage. And it gets even worse if you want to run Columbina in a Hyperbloom team on one side and then play Zibai on the other side, because without Columbina, Zibai just falls off. Her second best option after that is Iluga at C6, and yes, it's C6. You'd have to be insanely lucky to reach that quickly. After that, the next option is Zilonin, but she is massively weaker than Columbina here, and team building becomes more awkward because of Zilonin's passive when you mix non-geo elements. We'll compare all the DPS units properly at the end, but before that, let's move on to the next big DPS. And yes, Mavuika is still one of the strongest DPS characters in the game. Just like Zibai wants Ascendant Gleam support, Mavuika also wants a Notlon teammate to maximize her damage, especially Shilonin or Sitlali. And Sitlali is her best in-slot support, especially when you're playing Mavuika as your main DPS, because that Melt archetype is still one of the strongest team structures in the entire game. It has the raw power to brute force almost everything. But here's the huge advantage Mavuika has compared to Lunar DPS. She has multiple real teams. Her Vape teams with Farina are still strong. Her Overload teams with Iansan are still strong, and even Mono Pyro teams with Durin still work. And this flexibility is something Lunar DPS just don't have, because most of them are locked into reaction-specific setups. On top of that, Mavuika also has support value. She can function as a buffer or sub-DPS, which is a massive plus, because she can support other not-LAN DPS units or even older DPS units, especially if you don't own Sitlali and you're forced to use Mavuika differently. But even with all that, Mavuika does have real disadvantages. First, unlike Lauma, Inefa, and Columbina, who are not only the best supports in their respective elements, but also some of the strongest supports in the entire game, Sitlali is currently tied to only 2 truly top-tier teams. One is with Skirk, where she functions as a Cinder City holder and Thrilling Tales holder, and the second one is Mavuika Melt. Outside of those, many Sitlali teams, like Nuvalet Freeze, Chaska teams, and Mualati teams, are simply not as strong anymore compared to the new DPS meta. So if you don't plan on playing Mavuika or Skirk, Sitlali becomes much less valuable, and that naturally makes Mavuika feel more restrictive. Second, because Mavuika is an older DPS, she will struggle more in future endgame modes like Stygian, where bosses will increasingly be designed around lunar DPS mechanics. And third, and this matters a lot, Mavuika is not as easy to play. Yes, you can play her casually by holding left click and doing donuts, but if you actually want her maximum damage output in current DPS checks, you need to perform her proper combos. And compared to Flynn's and Zibai, who don't really require combos, Mavuika becomes much harder, especially for mobile players or anyone who doesn't want to try hard. And sadly, if you only play her with basic donuts, she ends up performing worse than the lunar DPS units, which can make her overall value feel lower than you'd expect. Now, coming to Skirk, her situation is different. She is restrictive, similar to Zibai, or arguably even worse, because you cannot run any elements other than Hydro and Cryo with her. On top of that, she also needs Escoffier to compete with current meta units. And just like how Sitlali mainly works with Mavuika, Escoffier is essentially locked to Skirk. I'm not saying she doesn't work with anyone else, but when we talk about best teams, Escoffier is designed specifically for Skirk. As a result, Skirk has dropped a lot in DPS rankings. Before Nodcry, she was the second best DPS in the game. Now, her best team sits around rank 5 or 6, and we've only received the first 4 Nodcry DPS units so far. But is she bad? No, absolutely not. She is still the only truly viable Cryo DPS in the game right now, and for players who specifically want a Cryo DPS, she is your only real option. She is still one of the strongest hypercarry DPS units. Her playstyle is simple, and as mentioned earlier, even if you don't have Escoffier, she is still usable. Yes, you will lose a lot of damage, but she remains functional. Just don't expect her to clear Fearless content without Escoffier, especially after a few more patches. So now, let's create a proper priority list. If you already own a Lunar DPS, it is recommended to skip Zibai and fully invest into your existing one. If you do not own any Lunar DPS and you have Columbina, then Zibai becomes a great option. But if you don't have Columbina, then it is strongly recommended to skip Zibai. For players who already have Sitlali or Escoffier, it is usually better to complete your existing teams instead of pulling brand new DPS units. Now, for players who have Columbina, don't own a Lunar DPS, and already have one of the two, Mavuika or Skirk, which DPS should you pull next? My top priority would be Mavuika. She is the safest option because even if you can't run Melt, she can still function as a support or in other archetypes like Vape or Overload. Second priority would be Zibai, because she's simply stronger than Skirk in the current meta, especially if you have higher constellations on Iluga. And future endgame content will be built around Zibai, which is a massive advantage over Skirk. That said, all 3 of these DPS units are extremely strong. If you pick any of them and build their proper teams, they will perform very well. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and don't forget to join our